The autumn leaves crunched beneath Sarah Mitchell's sneakers as she walked down Elm Street on that crisp October morning in 1998. The 16-year-old adjusted her burgundy backpack, heavy with textbooks for her junior year at Millbrook High School. The small town of Millbrook, nestled in upstate New York, was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where parents felt safe letting their children walk to school alone. "Have a good day, sweetheart," Linda Mitchell called from the front porch of their modest two-story colonial home. She waved, coffee mug in hand, watching her daughter's familiar figure disappear around the corner of Oak Avenue. It was 7:23 a.m., according to the kitchen clock she'd glanced at moments before. Robert Mitchell had already left for his job at the local hardware store, but not before kissing Sarah goodbye and reminding her about her math test. "You studied hard for this one," he'd said, ruffling her brown hair. "I know you'll do great." Sarah had rolled her eyes in that typical teenage way, but smiled. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing algebra equations at the kitchen table while her mother prepared dinner. The normalcy of that Tuesday morning would later haunt both parents. How ordinary everything seemed. How routine. How perfectly unremarkable. At Millbrook High, first period began at 8:15 a.m. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's English teacher, noticed the empty desk in the third row, but assumed the girl was simply running late. Sarah was a good student, never one to skip class without reason. When she failed to appear for second period algebra, the very test she'd studied so diligently for, concern began to creep in. By lunchtime, the school had contacted the Mitchell household. Linda's heart dropped when she heard the secretary's voice on the phone. "Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah hasn't been in any of her classes today. Is she ill?" The panic set in immediately. Linda called Robert at the store, her voice trembling. "She left for school this morning, just like always. I watched her walk down the street." Robert closed the store early and rushed home, finding his wife pacing frantically in their living room. They drove the route Sarah would have taken to school, their eyes scanning sidewalks, yards, and alleys. Nothing. No sign of their daughter, no clues, no witnesses who remembered seeing her after 7:23 a.m. that morning. Officer Mark Stevens arrived at the Mitchell home by 3:30 p.m. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that tried to reassure the frantic parents. "These cases usually resolve quickly," he told them, pulling out his notepad. "Teenagers sometimes make impulsive decisions. Has Sarah been upset about anything lately? Any problems at school or with friends?" Linda shook her head vigorously. "No, nothing like that. Sarah's happy. She's doing well in school. She has good friends. She wouldn't just disappear." Officer Stevens took detailed notes about Sarah's appearance. 5 feet 4 inches tall, shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a blue denim jacket over a white t-shirt, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Her backpack was burgundy with silver zippers, containing her school books and a small wallet with $15. As evening approached, more officers joined the search. They combed through Millbrook's quiet neighborhoods with flashlights, calling Sarah's name. Neighbors emerged from their homes to help, forming impromptu search parties that scoured the nearby woods and the banks of Miller Creek. But Millbrook seemed to have simply swallowed Sarah Mitchell whole, leaving behind no trace, no explanation, and a family whose world had been shattered in the span of a single, ordinary Tuesday morning. Detective Frank Rossi arrived in Millbrook 3 days after Sarah's disappearance. The state police had decided to assign their most experienced missing persons investigator to the case, recognizing that the local department might need additional resources. At 42, Rossi had worked dozens of missing person cases, but something about Sarah Mitchell's disappearance troubled him from the moment he reviewed the initial reports. "Walk me through it again," Rossi said to Officer Stevens as they stood at the corner of Elm Street and Oak Avenue, the last confirmed location where Sarah had been seen. The morning was gray and cold, with a light drizzle that made everything seem more ominous. Stevens consulted his notes. "Mrs. Mitchell watched her daughter from the porch until she turned this corner at approximately 7:23 a.m. The school is 8 blocks from here, normally a 12-minute walk." Sarah's routine was consistent. She'd been walking this same route every school day for 2 years since they moved to Millbrook. Rossi studied the residential street. Modest homes lined both sides, each with small front yards and mature oak trees that created a canopy over the sidewalk. "Have you canvassed every house along her route?" "Twice," Stevens replied. "Most people were either getting ready for work or had already left. The Hendersons at 247 Oak said they saw her walking past around 7:25, but that's the last confirmed sighting." They walked the route slowly, Rossi noting potential hiding spots, abandoned buildings, or areas where someone could have approached Sarah without being seen. Millbrook was painfully quiet at this time of morning, the kind of silence that could hide secrets. At the high school, Principal Margaret Walsh led them through Sarah's typical day. She was a model student, Walsh emphasized, showing them Sarah's locker. No disciplinary issues, good grades, well liked by her peers and teachers. The idea that she'd run away voluntarily just doesn't fit her character. Rossi examined the contents of Sarah's locker, textbooks arranged neatly, a small mirror, lip gloss, and a photo of her family at last summer's county fair. Everything suggested a girl planning to return. Interviews with Sarah's friends painted a consistent picture. Jessica Norton, her best friend since freshman year, was particularly helpful. Sarah was excited about the homecoming dance next week, Jessica told Rossi, tears streaming down her face. She'd bought a new dress and was planning to ask Tommy Morrison to go with her. She wouldn't just leave without telling anyone. Tommy Morrison, a quiet 17-year-old from Sarah's chemistry class, confirmed Jessica's account. She seemed normal on Monday, he said nervously. We talked about the upcoming test and made plans to study together after school today. I mean, the day she disappeared. By the end of the first week, Rossi had compiled a comprehensive timeline. Sarah's last known activities included studying at home Tuesday evening, watching television with her parents, and going to bed at her usual time of 10:30 p.m. She'd set her alarm for 6:45 a.m. and had laid out her clothes the night before, the same clothes she was wearing when she disappeared. The investigation expanded beyond Millbrook's borders. State police checked bus stations, airports, and train stations within a 50-mile radius. They contacted relatives and family friends across the country. Sarah's photograph appeared on local news broadcasts and in newspapers throughout New York State. But as days turned into weeks, the leads dried up. No ransom demands, no sightings, no physical evidence. It was as if Sarah Mitchell had simply ceased to exist the moment she turned the corner from Elm Street onto Oak Avenue. The case consumed Rossi. He'd wake up at night thinking about the missing girl, replaying every interview, reconsidering every possibility. In his experience, people didn't just vanish without leaving some trace behind. Someone had to know something. 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, the FBI joined the investigation. Agent Catherine Blake, a specialist in abduction cases, arrived with a team of forensic experts and behavioral analysts. Her presence signaled that this was no longer considered a simple runaway case. Everyone now feared the worst. The command center was established in Millbrook's community center, transforming the building where Sarah had attended school dances and town meetings into the nerve center of a massive search operation. Maps covered every wall, marked with color-coded pins indicating search areas, witness locations, and potential leads. "We're treating this as a stranger abduction," Agent Blake announced during the first joint briefing with local and state police. Her voice was professional, but carried an underlying urgency that made everyone in the room understand the gravity of the situation. Statistics show that if a child taken by a stranger isn't found within the first 72 hours, the chances of recovery alive drop significantly. We're past that window, but we're not giving up. The search expanded dramatically. Volunteers from neighboring towns arrived daily, organized into teams that systematically combed through every inch of the surrounding countryside. Bloodhounds were brought in to follow scent trails, though they consistently lost Sarah's trail at the same corner of Oak Avenue where she was last seen. Robert and Linda Mitchell aged years in those few weeks. Robert took leave from the hardware store, spending his days distributing flyers and his nights staring at the phone, hoping for news. Linda barely slept, maintaining a vigil in Sarah's room, keeping everything exactly as her daughter had left it. "Someone must have seen something," Linda insisted during one of her daily visits to the command center. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep. People don't just disappear in broad daylight on a busy street. But Oak Avenue wasn't as busy as Linda remembered. The investigation revealed that most residents left for work between 7 and 7:30 a.m., creating a brief window when the street was surprisingly deserted. The few people who were home, elderly Mrs. Patterson recovering from hip surgery, Mr. Chen, who worked night shifts, had been watching television or sleeping. Detective Rossi found himself drawn repeatedly to the same question: why had no one heard screams? If Sarah had been grabbed by a stranger, surely she would have called for help. The girl was athletic, a member of the school's track team, not someone who would go quietly. The behavioral analysts developed several theories. Perhaps Sarah knew her abductor, someone she trusted enough to approach willingly. Or maybe she'd been lured into a vehicle under false pretenses, someone claiming to be lost and needing directions, or pretending to know her parents. Agent Blake focused on registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius. Each one was interviewed, their alibis checked and rechecked. Several had no solid alibi for the morning of October 13th, but none could be definitively connected to Sarah's disappearance. The investigation took a particularly dark turn when they discovered that Joseph Martinez, a convicted child molester, had been released from prison just 6 months before Sarah disappeared. Martinez had family connections to Millbrook, having visited his sister there several times over the summer. For 48 hours, it seemed like they might have their breakthrough. Martinez was brought in for questioning, his sister's house was searched, and his movements on October 13th were reconstructed minute by minute. But his alibi held. He'd been at a job interview in Albany at the time of Sarah's disappearance, with multiple witnesses and documentation to prove it. The media attention intensified. Sarah's photograph appeared on milk cartons and missing person websites. The story was featured on America's Most Wanted, generating hundreds of tips that all led nowhere. Psychics called the police station daily, claiming to have visions of Sarah's location, but their predictions were as varied as they were useless. Halloween came and went without celebration in Millbrook. The usual decorations seemed inappropriate. Trick-or-treating felt wrong when one of their own children remained missing. The town existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. By Thanksgiving, the active search had been scaled back. The volunteers had returned to their normal lives. The FBI team had moved on to other cases, and only Detective Rossi remained fully committed to finding Sarah Mitchell. 2 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, and Detective Frank Rossi stared at the thick file that had become his obsession. The case had officially been classified as cold, but Rossi couldn't let it go. Every few months he would pull out the file, spread the photographs and witness statements across his desk, and search for something he might have missed. The Mitchell family had changed dramatically. Robert had aged visibly, his hair now completely grey, deep lines etched around his eyes. He'd sold the hardware store and taken a job as a security guard at the local mall, claiming he needed work that didn't require much interaction with people. Linda had suffered what the doctors called a nervous breakdown 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, and had spent time in a psychiatric facility upstate. "They come in every few months," Officer Stevens told Rossi during one of their informal discussions about the case. Stevens had been promoted to sergeant, but still felt personally invested in Sarah's disappearance. "Mr. Mitchell asks if there's been any new developments, any new leads. I can see the hope dying in his eyes a little more each time." The case had taken its toll on the entire Millbrook Police Department. Chief Harold Morrison, a 30-year veteran who had planned to retire the year after Sarah disappeared, stayed on for 3 additional years, unable to leave with such a major case unsolved. When he finally did retire, his replacement, Chief Patricia Williams, inherited not just a police department, but a community still haunted by unanswered questions. Rossi had developed his own theories over the years. The complete absence of physical evidence suggested either incredible luck on the part of the perpetrator or careful planning. The fact that Sarah's scent trail ended so abruptly at Oak Avenue indicated she had likely been taken in a vehicle, but no one had heard a car door slam or an engine start during that critical time window. "What bothers me most," Rossi confided to Agent Blake during one of their periodic phone conversations, "is the precision of it all. Someone knew exactly when and where to find Sarah alone. They knew her routine, her route to school, the timing of when neighbors would be distracted." Agent Blake, now working cases in Virginia, agreed. "It suggests either extended surveillance or inside knowledge, someone who understood the rhythms of that neighborhood, who had been watching and waiting for the right opportunity." The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about Millbrook's seemingly innocent facade. Several affairs had been exposed when alibis were checked. A few residents had minor criminal records they'd hidden from their neighbors, and the town's image as a safe haven had been permanently tarnished. New residents arriving in Millbrook were quickly informed about Sarah Mitchell. The story had become part of the town's identity. Whispered warnings shared between mothers at the grocery store. Cautionary tales told to teenagers who complained about being driven to school instead of walking. Sarah's bedroom remained unchanged, a shrine that Linda maintained with religious devotion. The homecoming dress Sarah had planned to wear still hung in the closet, their tags attached. Her schoolbooks sat on the desk where she'd left them after studying for the math test she never took. Detective Rossi visited the Mitchell home occasionally, not in any official capacity, but out of a sense of personal responsibility. During one such visit, Robert shared something that had been troubling him. "The night before she disappeared, Sarah seemed different," Robert said, staring out the window toward the street where his daughter had last been seen. "Not upset exactly, but preoccupied, like she had something on her mind. Linda thinks I'm imagining it, remembering details that weren't there, but I can't shake the feeling that Sarah knew something was going to happen." "Did she say anything specific?" Rossi asked, though they'd covered this ground many times before. "She hugged us both goodnight, which wasn't unusual, but she held on longer than normal. And she said, 'I love you guys,' in a way that felt final. At the time I thought she was just being affectionate, but now—" Robert's voice trailed off. The conversation haunted Rossi for weeks. Had Sarah suspected she was in danger? Had someone threatened her, warned her to keep quiet about something? The possibility that Sarah might have had advanced knowledge of her fate opened entirely new avenues of investigation, but also made the case even more heartbreaking. By 2003, 5 years after the disappearance, most people in Millbrook rarely spoke Sarah's name aloud. The missing person posters had faded and been replaced by newer announcements. Life had moved on, as life always does, but Sarah Mitchell remained frozen in time, forever 16, forever walking to school on a crisp October morning. By 2013, 15 years after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, Millbrook had transformed into a different town. New housing developments had sprouted on the outskirts, chain restaurants had replaced local diners, and many of the faces that had once searched desperately for Sarah were gone, moved away, retired or passed on. Detective Frank Rossi, now nearing retirement himself, had been promoted to lieutenant, but still kept Sarah's file in his desk drawer. The case had followed him through 3 different office relocations, and he digitized every document, every photograph, every witness statement. What had once filled 2 filing cabinets now existed on a single hard drive, but the weight of it felt unchanged. The Millbrook Police Department had grown significantly, with new officers who knew Sarah's story only as departmental legend. During training sessions, Chief Williams would use the Mitchell case as an example of the importance of thorough documentation and community cooperation. But for most of the younger officers, Sarah was just another cold case statistic. Linda Mitchell had never fully recovered from her daughter's disappearance. She'd returned from psychiatric treatment a different person, quieter, more fragile, prone to sudden episodes of anxiety when she encountered teenage girls who resembled Sarah. She'd found solace in grief counseling groups and had become an advocate for families of missing children, but the light in her eyes had never returned. Robert had remarried 3 years earlier to a widow named Margaret, who understood loss and didn't try to replace Sarah's memory. They'd moved to a smaller house across town, unable to continue living in the home where Sarah's empty bedroom served as a constant reminder of their tragedy. The case had produced several false leads over the years. In 2007, construction workers found human remains in a wooded area 20 miles from Millbrook, triggering a brief media frenzy and renewed hope from the Mitchell family. DNA testing revealed the bones belonged to a homeless man who had died of natural causes years earlier. In 2010, a woman in California claimed to be Sarah Mitchell, saying she'd been kidnapped and held captive before escaping. The story unraveled quickly when DNA testing proved she was a troubled young woman seeking attention, but not before putting the Mitchell family through another emotional ordeal. Technology had advanced significantly since 1998. Lieutenant Rossi had submitted Sarah's case to the FBI's new missing persons database, which used sophisticated algorithms to cross-reference disappearances across state lines. He'd also worked with forensic artists to create age progression images, showing what Sarah might look like as a woman in her 30s. These updated images were distributed through social media, a tool that hadn't existed when Sarah first disappeared. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons shared her photograph thousands of times, reaching audiences the original investigation could never have accessed. But still, no credible leads emerged. The town's collective memory of the case had begun to fade, replaced by more recent tragedies and concerns. Younger residents knew the basic story, but lacked the emotional connection felt by those who had lived through the initial search. Sarah Mitchell was becoming more myth than memory. Officer Stevens, now a captain and second in command at the department, occasionally brought up the case during staff meetings. "We have a responsibility to that family," he would remind his officers. "As long as this department exists, we don't give up on Sarah Mitchell." The case had shaped Stephen's entire career. He'd become an expert in missing persons investigations, attending specialized training conferences and consulting on similar cases throughout the state. But Sarah remained his white whale, the one case that had defined his understanding of both police work and human nature. During quiet moments at the station, Stephens would sometimes walk past the evidence room where Sarah's case materials were stored. Box 1998-045 contained everything they'd collected: hair samples from her brush, fingerprints lifted from her bedroom, witness statements, photographs of her room exactly as she'd left it, and hundreds of tips that had led nowhere. The most haunting item in the box was Sarah's appointment calendar, recovered from her bedroom. October 13th, 1998, the day she disappeared, had been marked with "Math Test, Second Period" in her careful handwriting. The mundane normalcy of that notation served as a stark reminder that Sarah had expected to return home that day, had planned for a future that never came. Lieutenant Rossi often wondered if Sarah Mitchell was still alive somewhere, perhaps with no memory of her previous life, living under a different identity. Or if she'd been murdered that first day, her remains hidden so well they'd never be found. Both possibilities haunted him, but the uncertainty was perhaps worst of all. October 15, 2018, exactly 20 years and 2 days after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, began as an ordinary Monday morning at the Millbrook Police Department. The building, constructed in 1987, was undergoing its first major renovation. Chief Patricia Williams had finally secured funding to replace the aging roof, update the electrical system, and expand the evidence storage facility. Martinez Construction had been working on the project for 3 weeks, and foreman Tony Martinez was growing increasingly frustrated with the complications they kept discovering. The building's original blueprints didn't match the actual construction, and they'd already found asbestos insulation and outdated wiring that required specialized removal. "Chief Williams," Tony called down from the roof around 10:30 a.m., his voice carrying a note of concern that made several officers look up from their desks. "You need to see this." Williams climbed the ladder, followed by Lieutenant Rossi, who had been reviewing case files in his office when he heard the commotion. What they found on the roof defied explanation. Wedged between 2 HVAC units, in a space so narrow and awkward that it would have been nearly impossible to access without removing the equipment, was a burgundy backpack. The fabric was weathered and faded from 20 years of exposure to the elements, but the silver zippers were still intact, and through the partially opened main compartment, they could see the corner of what appeared to be a textbook. "Nobody touch anything," Williams ordered immediately, though the construction workers had already stepped back instinctively. "Tony, how long have these HVAC units been here?" "According to the maintenance records, they were installed in 1999, Tony replied, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. "We had to move them to access the structural supports underneath. That's when we found whatever this is." Lieutenant Rossi felt his heart pounding as he stared at the backpack. After 20 years, he knew every detail of Sarah Mitchell's case by heart, including the exact description of what she'd been carrying the day she disappeared. The color was right, the size was right, and the distinctive silver zipper pulls matched perfectly. "Get everyone off this roof now," Rossi commanded. "This is a crime scene." Within an hour, the Millbrook Police Department roof was crawling with investigators. The state crime scene unit had been called in, along with Agent Catherine Blake, who had driven up from Virginia the moment she received Williams's phone call. The backpack was photographed from every angle before being carefully removed and transported to the forensics lab. The contents were processed with the same meticulous care used in fresh crime scenes: Sarah's algebra textbook, her English literature anthology, a spiral notebook filled with her handwriting, her student ID card, and a wallet containing exactly $15, all items that had been meticulously documented in the original missing person report. But it was the condition of the items that raised the most disturbing questions. Despite being exposed to weather for 2 decades, everything was remarkably well preserved. The textbooks showed water damage and sun fading, but the notebook pages were still legible, and the photographs in Sarah's wallet were still recognizable. "This changes everything," Agent Blake told the assembled investigators during an emergency briefing that evening. The backpack was placed on this roof after the HVAC units were installed in 1999, which means someone had access to it, and access to this building, months after Sarah disappeared. The implications were staggering. If Sarah's backpack had been on the police station roof for nearly 20 years, it meant someone with knowledge of her disappearance had deliberately placed it there. More disturbing still, it suggested that person had intimate knowledge of the building's layout and security protocols. Lieutenant Rossi stared at the evidence photos spread across the conference table. Who would have had access to this roof in 1999? Chief Williams pulled up the department's personnel records. Let's see. We had 12 officers on the force in 1999. 5 are still with the department, 3 have retired but still live in town, 2 moved away, and 2 have died. What about maintenance workers, contractors, building inspectors? Agent Blake asked. The HVAC installation would have required multiple people over several days, Williams replied. Contractors, electricians, building inspectors, possibly city officials. We're talking about dozens of potential suspects. The discovery rekindled media interest in Sarah's case. Local news stations ran special reports, and national networks picked up the story. The headline, "Missing Girl's Backpack Found on Police Station Roof After 20 Years," captured public imagination and sparked widespread speculation about police corruption and cover-ups. Robert Mitchell, now 62 years old, sat in stunned silence when Chief Williams personally delivered the news. His second wife, Margaret, held his hand as Williams explained the discovery and its implications. "Does this mean you're closer to finding out what happened to Sarah?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means we have a new lead after 20 years, Williams replied carefully. "We're treating this as an active investigation again." That night, Lieutenant Rossi couldn't sleep. The discovery of Sarah's backpack had vindicated his belief that someone in Millbrook knew more about her disappearance than they'd ever admitted. But it also meant that person had been watching, waiting, perhaps even laughing as the investigation struggled for leads. The question that haunted him most was why now? Why had the backpack been discovered at this particular moment during this particular renovation? Was it coincidence, or had someone planned for it to be found? The discovery of Sarah Mitchell's backpack on the police station roof sent shockwaves through the Millbrook Police Department that extended far beyond the building's newly renovated walls. Within 48 hours, the State Attorney General's office had launched a formal investigation into potential police corruption, and every officer who had worked for the department since 1998 found themselves under scrutiny. Agent Blake had been joined by a team of federal investigators, transforming the department's conference room into a secondary command center. The walls were now covered with organizational charts, timeline analyses, and photographs of every person who had worked for or contracted with the police department over the past 20 years. "We're looking at this from 2 angles, Agent Blake explained to the assembled task force. "Either someone with legitimate access to the building placed the backpack there, or someone unlawfully entered police property to plant evidence. Both scenarios suggest intimate knowledge of our investigation and procedures." Lieutenant Rossi found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both an investigator and a potential suspect. His 20-year obsession with the case, while admirable, also made him a person of interest. He had been present during the initial investigation, had access to evidence, and possessed detailed knowledge of Sarah's belongings. "I need to ask you some difficult questions, Frank," Agent Blake said during his formal interview. They had worked together before, but the dynamic had changed completely. "Your involvement in this case has been unusually personal, some might say obsessive." Rossi met her gaze steadily. "That girl's disappearance has haunted me for 20 years. If being thorough and refusing to give up makes me obsessive, then I'll wear that label. But I didn't plant evidence on our own roof, Catherine. I've been trying to solve this case, not sabotage it." The interview lasted 4 hours and covered every aspect of Rossi's involvement in the case. His phone records were subpoenaed, his financial records examined, and his movements on key dates scrutinized. It was a necessary but humiliating process for a veteran investigator who had dedicated his career to seeking justice. Captain Stevens faced similar questioning. As one of the first officers on the scene in 1998, and someone who had remained with the department throughout the investigation, he was automatically considered a person of interest. His wife of 12 years watched nervously as investigators searched their home, looking for any connection to Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. "This is insane," Stevens told his wife that evening as they sat in their kitchen, feeling violated and confused. "I've spent 20 years trying to find that girl. Why would I hide evidence that could help solve the case?" But the investigators were thorough and impartial. Every current and former officer was subjected to polygraph tests, background checks, and detailed interviews about their whereabouts during key dates. The process revealed minor infractions and personal indiscretions, but nothing directly related to Sarah's disappearance. The examination of civilian contractors proved more complex. Martinez Construction provided records showing that 7 different workers had accessed the police station roof during the HVAC installation in 1999. 3 of the workers had since died, 2 had moved out of state, and 1 had a criminal record that included burglary and assault charges. Detective Ray Harrison, who had retired from the force in 2005, became a particular focus of the investigation when it was discovered that he had been experiencing financial difficulties in 1999 and had been moonlighting as a security consultant for local businesses. His access to the police station, combined with potential financial motivations, made him a prime suspect. Ray was always a good cop, Chief Williams told Agent Blake during one of their daily briefings, but he went through a messy divorce in '99, and I know he was struggling to pay his bills. If someone offered him money to look the other way or provide inside information, Harrison submitted to questioning voluntarily, but maintained his innocence. His alibi for the original disappearance was solid. He had been on duty that morning, and his activities were well documented. But the period when the backpack might have been placed on the roof was more problematic. There were several opportunities when he could have accessed the building after hours. The investigation also revealed disturbing gaps in the building's security during the late 1990s. The alarm system was frequently malfunctioning, spare keys were inadequately controlled, and the roof access was secured by nothing more than a basic padlock that could be easily bypassed. This building was like a sieve in 1999, security consultant James Wright told the investigators after reviewing historical records. Any determined individual with basic knowledge of the layout could have gained access to the roof without triggering alarms or being detected. The media attention intensified as details of the internal investigation leaked to reporters. Headlines like "Police investigate themselves in missing girl case" and "Corruption scandal rocks small-town police" dominated local news coverage. The department's reputation, already damaged by their failure to solve Sarah's disappearance, was further tarnished by implications of a cover-up. Community trust, carefully rebuilt over 20 years, began to erode again. Residents who had supported the police during the original investigation now questioned everything they had been told. Had officers been protecting one of their own? Had evidence been deliberately suppressed or destroyed? Robert Mitchell watched the news coverage with a mixture of hope and anguish. After 2 decades of wondering what had happened to his daughter, he was finally seeing real progress in the investigation. But the possibility that police officers, people he had trusted and cooperated with, might have been involved in covering up Sarah's fate was almost too painful to consider. "I just want to know the truth," he told reporters who gathered outside his modest home. "Whatever happened to Sarah, whoever was involved, I need to know. This family has lived with questions for 20 years. We deserve answers." 3 weeks after the backpack discovery, forensic analyst Dr. Sarah Chen made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. Working in the state crime lab, she had been methodically processing every item found in Sarah Mitchell's backpack, using advanced techniques that hadn't been available in 1998. "I found something," Dr. Chen announced during a video conference with the task force. On her screen, she displayed a magnified image of what appeared to be a small piece of paper wedged deep inside the backpack's front pocket. It's a receipt, dated October 14, 1998, the day after Sarah disappeared. The receipt was from Murphy's gas station on Route 9, about 15 miles outside Millbrook. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., and the purchase was for $23.50 in gasoline, paid in cash. More importantly, the receipt had been torn and crumpled, suggesting it had been discarded hastily. Agent Blake felt her pulse quicken. Someone bought gas the night after Sarah disappeared, and somehow that receipt ended up in her backpack. Either Sarah was alive on October 14th, or someone else put it there. Lieutenant Rossi was already pulling up the original case files on his computer. Murphy's gas station. "We canvassed every business along Route 9 during the initial investigation. Let me check what they told us." The original report showed that Murphy's station had been questioned on October 16, 1998, 3 days after Sarah's disappearance. The night manager, a man named Pete Kowalski, claimed he didn't remember serving anyone matching Sarah's description and said the station didn't have security cameras. "We need to find Pete Kowalski," Blake ordered, "and we need to get the original transaction records from Murphy's, if they still exist." The search for Kowalski proved challenging. Murphy's gas station had closed in 2003, and the business records had been destroyed. Pete Kowalski had moved to Florida in 2001, but his current address was unknown. It took investigators 2 days to track him down to a trailer park outside Jacksonville. Now, 68 years old and suffering from emphysema, Kowalski initially claimed he couldn't remember anything about October 1998, but when shown the receipt and reminded of the serious nature of the investigation, his story began to change. "Look, I was scared back then," Kowalski admitted during a phone interview with Agent Blake. "I had a record, you know, drug possession, some other minor stuff. When the cops came asking questions, I just wanted them to leave me alone." "What really happened that night, Pete?" Blake pressed. Kowalski coughed violently before continuing. "A guy came in late, maybe around midnight. He was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. Bought gas and paid cash, but he seemed wrong, you know, like he was running from something. Can you describe him? White guy, maybe 40, 45, average height, dark hair, wearing a uniform of some kind, navy blue, like a security guard or maybe a cop. He had a badge on his shirt, but I didn't get a good look at it." Blake felt the pieces clicking into place. "Did you see his vehicle?" "Dark sedan, maybe a Crown Victoria, the kind cops drive. That's why I thought he might be police." The revelation that someone in a police uniform had been at Murphy's gas station hours after Sarah's disappearance sent shockwaves through the investigation. Blake immediately ordered a review of all duty rosters and vehicle assignments for October 14th, 1998. The records showed that 3 Millbrook police officers had been on duty that night: Officer Mark Stevens, Officer David Walsh, and Detective Ray Harrison. All 3 drove Crown Victoria patrol cars, and all 3 had documented their activities throughout their shifts, but there was a gap in Detective Harrison's timeline. Between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., he had marked himself as on patrol with no specific location or activity noted. It was a common practice for officers to use this designation when driving through town, but it also provided no alibi for the time when someone had purchased gas at Murphy's station. "We need to bring Harrison in again," Blake told Chief Williams. "And this time it won't be voluntary." Detective Ray Harrison, now 59 and working as a private security consultant, was arrested at his home on November 8, 2018. The charges were obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, but everyone knew more serious charges could follow if the investigation revealed his involvement in Sarah's disappearance. Harrison's arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook's law enforcement community. He had been a respected officer for 15 years, known for his dedication and professionalism. The idea that he might have been involved in covering up a crime, or worse, committing one, was almost incomprehensible to his former colleagues. "Ray was like a brother to me," Captain Stevens told his wife that evening. "We worked together for years. I can't believe he could be involved in something like this." But the evidence was mounting. A search of Harrison's home revealed financial records showing he had been in severe debt in 1998, owing money to local bookmakers and facing potential foreclosure on his house. His ex-wife, contacted by investigators, revealed that he had come home late on October 13th and had seemed agitated and nervous for weeks afterward. "He wasn't the same after that girl disappeared," Martha Harrison told Agent Blake. "He became obsessed with the case, but not in a good way. He would stay up late reading the files, making notes, talking to himself. I thought he was just being thorough, but now I wonder if he was trying to cover his tracks." The interrogation of Ray Harrison lasted 12 hours, with his lawyer present throughout. He maintained his innocence regarding Sarah's disappearance, but eventually admitted to planting the backpack on the police station roof. "I found it," Harrison finally confessed, his voice breaking. "I found the backpack in 1999 during a routine patrol. It was in the woods off County Road 7, about 10 miles from town. I should have reported it immediately, but I panicked." "Why did you panic, Ray?" Blake asked. Harrison's answer would change everything about the Sarah Mitchell case. "Because I knew who put it there," Detective Ray Harrison whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for a cup of water. The interrogation room at the state police barracks had grown cold in the early morning hours, and Harrison's confession was about to expose a truth that had been buried for 20 years. Agent Blake leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. "Who, Ray? Who put Sarah's backpack in those woods?" Harrison's lawyer placed a warning hand on his client's arm, but Harrison shook his head. "I can't live with this anymore. 20 years of watching that family suffer, watching Frank Rossi tear himself apart trying to solve this case. I have to tell the truth." He took a shaky breath before continuing. "It was Chief Morrison, Harold Morrison. He killed Sarah Mitchell." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Harold Morrison had been Millbrook's beloved police chief for 30 years, Retiring in 2001 as a respected pillar of the community, he had led the search for Sarah, had comforted her family, had worked tirelessly to solve the case that had defined his final years in law enforcement. "That's impossible," Agent Blake said, though her training told her to remain neutral. Chief Morrison was leading the investigation. Harrison laughed bitterly. "Don't you see? That was perfect cover. Who would suspect the man in charge of finding her? He controlled every aspect of the investigation, decided which leads to follow, which evidence to prioritize. He was playing God with that family's lives." Blake's mind raced through the implications. If Harrison was telling the truth, it meant the entire investigation had been compromised from day one. Every decision, every missed clue, every dead end, all potentially orchestrated by the very man responsible for Sarah's death. "Start from the beginning, Ray. Tell me everything you know." Harrison's story unfolded like a nightmare. On October 13, 1998, he had been finishing his shift when Chief Morrison called him into his office. Morrison seemed agitated, nervous in a way Harrison had never seen before. "He told me there had been an accident," Harrison recalled. "Said a girl had been hit by a car early that morning, and the driver had panicked and fled the scene. He said the girl was already dead, and he was trying to protect an innocent family from having their lives destroyed over a tragic mistake." According to Harrison, Morrison explained that the driver was a prominent local businessman with a wife and children, someone who had swerved to avoid a dog and accidentally struck Sarah as she walked to school. The businessman had called Morrison directly, terrified about what would happen to his family if he was charged with vehicular homicide. "Morrison made it sound like an act of mercy," Harrison continued. "He said Sarah was dead no matter what we did, but we could save another family from being destroyed. He asked me to help dispose of the evidence and create a missing person case instead of a vehicular homicide." Blake struggled to maintain her composure. "And you agreed?" "I was young, I was in debt, and I trusted my chief completely. Morrison said he would handle everything, that I just needed to help move the body and stay quiet. He promised to take care of my financial problems in exchange for my silence." Harrison described driving to a remote location where Morrison had hidden Sarah's body. Together they had moved her to a different location, a deep ravine about 30 miles from Millbrook, where the body would never be found. Morrison had kept Sarah's backpack, claiming he needed to dispose of it separately to avoid any connection between the items and their location. A year later, I found the backpack during a routine patrol just sitting in the woods like Morrison had dropped it there. I realized he had been lying to me about disposing of it properly. That's when I started to suspect there was more to the story than he'd told me. Blake pressed for details. "What made you think Morrison was lying about the accident?" "Little things at first. The businessman he claimed was responsible. I never saw any evidence this person existed. Morrison wouldn't give me a name, said it was better if I didn't know, and the story didn't make sense. If it was really an accident, why not just report it and let the courts decide? Why create an elaborate cover-up?" Harrison's suspicions had grown over time, especially after Morrison's behavior during the investigation. The chief had seemed to steer the case away from certain areas, had dismissed potential leads that might have been promising, and had shown an unusual interest in controlling every aspect of the search. By 2000, I was convinced that Morrison had murdered Sarah himself and used me to help cover it up. But I was trapped. If I came forward, I'd be admitting to helping dispose of a body and obstruct justice. My career would be over, and I'd probably go to prison. "So you planted the backpack on the roof," Blake concluded. "Not right away. I held onto it for years, not knowing what to do. When Morrison retired in 2001, I thought about coming forward, but I was still scared. It wasn't until this year, when I heard about the renovation at the station, that I decided to act." Harrison explained that he had placed the backpack on the roof during the HVAC installation, knowing it would eventually be discovered during the construction work. He had hoped the discovery would reopen the case and lead investigators to the truth, but without directly implicating himself. "I thought maybe if the case was reopened with fresh eyes, someone would figure out what really happened. I couldn't live with the secret anymore, but I was too much of a coward to come forward directly." Agent Blake looked at the broken man across from her. After 20 years of carrying this terrible secret, Ray Harrison looked like he had aged decades in the past few hours. "Where is Sarah's body, Ray?" Harrison provided detailed directions to the ravine where he and Morrison had disposed of Sarah's remains. The location was remote, accessible only by hiking trails, which explained why she had never been found despite extensive searches. "One more question," Blake said. "If Morrison made up the story about the businessman and the accident, what really happened to Sarah?" Why did he kill her? Harrison met her eyes for the first time in hours. I've had 20 years to think about that, and I think I know the answer. Morrison was having an affair, Harrison said, his voice barely audible in the sterile interrogation room, with Sarah's mother, Linda Mitchell. Agent Blake felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. The confession that followed would expose a web of deception, betrayal and murder that had corrupted an entire community for 2 decades. Harrison explained that he had discovered the affair by accident in early 1998, when he had seen Chief Morrison's patrol car parked behind Linda Mitchell's house during school hours. Initially, he had assumed it was related to some kind of police business, but repeated sightings during Robert Mitchell's work hours had raised his suspicions. "I never said anything because it wasn't my business," Harrison continued. "Morrison was my boss, and what he did in his personal life was between him and his wife. But everything changed the day Sarah disappeared." According to Harrison's account, which investigators would later corroborate through phone records and witness statements, Sarah had discovered her mother's affair. On the morning of October 13, 1998, she had confronted Linda about the relationship, threatening to tell her father everything. "Morrison called me that morning in a panic," Harrison recalled. "He said there was a situation that needed immediate attention. When I arrived at the designated meeting spot on Oak Avenue, I found him standing over Sarah's body." The truth was far more sinister than the accident story Morrison had fabricated. Sarah had left for school as usual, but had doubled back home when she realized she had forgotten an important assignment. She had arrived to find Morrison and her mother together in the living room, their intimate conversation making their relationship unmistakably clear. Morrison's confession to Harrison, extracted 20 years too late, revealed that Sarah had been furious and betrayed. She had screamed at her mother, calling her a cheater and a liar, then had threatened to tell her father, the school principal, and anyone else who would listen about what she had witnessed. Morrison said Sarah was hysterical, that she wouldn't listen to reason. Harrison continued. He claimed he was just trying to calm her down, but Sarah started running toward the school, saying she was going to call her father from the principal's office. Morrison panicked and followed her in his patrol car. The confrontation had occurred on Oak Avenue, just around the corner from where Sarah was last seen alive. Morrison had pulled alongside the teenage girl and demanded she get into his car so they could discuss the situation rationally. When Sarah refused and continued running, Morrison had made a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said it was an accident at first, Harrison remembered, claimed he had grabbed Sarah's arm to stop her from running, and she had fallen and hit her head on the curb. But years later, when I started questioning his story, I realized the truth was probably much worse. Morrison had likely struck Sarah deliberately, either with his hands or with an object, killing her instantly in a moment of panic and rage. The realization that his career, his marriage, and his reputation would be destroyed if Sarah revealed his affair had driven him to murder. With Sarah dead on the street, Morrison had quickly loaded her body into his patrol car and called Harrison for help. The elaborate cover-up that followed, creating a missing person case, misdirecting the investigation, and manipulating evidence, had all been designed to protect Morrison's secret while destroying any connection between him and Sarah's death. Agent Blake ordered an immediate search of the ravine location Harrison had provided. Within 6 hours, search teams had located human remains buried in a shallow grave approximately 30 miles from Millbrook. Dental records would later confirm that the remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell. The arrest warrant for Harold Morrison was signed that same afternoon, but serving it would prove impossible. Morrison, now 73 years old and suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease, was residing in a memory care facility in Albany. His condition had deteriorated significantly over the past 2 years, and he no longer recognized family members or remembered basic details about his life. "He can't stand trial," Morrison's lawyer informed the district attorney during an emergency hearing. "My client doesn't remember being a police officer, let alone the events from 20 years ago. He's mentally incompetent." The legal proceedings became a complex battle over Morrison's fitness to stand trial. Medical evaluations confirmed that his dementia was genuine and severe, making it impossible for him to assist in his own defense or understand the charges against him. Meanwhile, the discovery of Sarah's remains brought both closure and renewed anguish to her family. Robert Mitchell, now 62, stood at the edge of the ravine where his daughter's body had been hidden for 2 decades. "She was so close," he whispered to investigators. "All these years, she was just 30 miles away, and we never knew." Linda Mitchell's role in the tragedy became a source of intense community debate. While she had not participated in Sarah's murder or the cover-up, her affair with Morrison had triggered the events that led to her daughter's death. The guilt had driven her to mental breakdown, and now the truth explained the severity of her psychological collapse. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Linda Mitchell, concluded that the woman had been living with survivor's guilt for 20 years, unconsciously blaming herself for Sarah's disappearance without understanding why. The human mind has remarkable ways of protecting itself from unbearable truths, Dr. Reeves explained to the Mitchell family. Linda's breakdown wasn't just about losing her daughter. It was about the unconscious knowledge that her actions had contributed to that loss. The Millbrook Police Department faced complete reorganization following the revelations. Chief Williams resigned in shame, unable to continue leading an organization that had been so thoroughly corrupted. Lieutenant Rossi, vindicated after 20 years of investigation, was offered the chief's position but declined, choosing instead to retire and write a book about the case. Captain Stevens, who had dedicated his career to finding Sarah Mitchell, struggled with the revelation that his mentor and former chief had been responsible for her death all along. Every lead we followed, every theory we developed, every sleepless night we spent working this case, Morrison was sitting right there, watching us chase shadows while he knew exactly what had happened, Stevens told his wife. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice and trust. The Sarah Mitchell case became a textbook example of how corruption within law enforcement could derail even the most well-intentioned investigations. Police academies across the country now study the case as a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight, transparency, and accountability within police departments. For Robert Mitchell, the truth brought both peace and sorrow. After 20 years of wondering what had happened to his daughter, he finally had answers. Sarah had been murdered by someone she should have been able to trust, someone whose job was to protect the innocent. "I forgive Linda," Robert told reporters outside the courthouse where Harold Morrison would have been tried if he had been competent. "She made a terrible mistake, but she didn't kill our daughter. Morrison did that, and now Sarah can finally rest in peace." Sarah Mitchell was buried in Millbrook Cemetery on a cold December day in 2018, exactly 20 years and 2 months after she had disappeared. The entire town attended the funeral, finally able to say goodbye to the girl whose disappearance had haunted their community for 2 decades. The case was officially closed on December 15, 2018, bringing an end to one of the longest-running missing person investigations in New York State history. But for those who had lived through the 20-year nightmare, the scars would never fully heal. Harold Morrison died in the memory care facility 18 months later, taking his detailed knowledge of Sarah's final moments to the grave. Ray Harrison was sentenced to 5 years in prison for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, but was released after serving 2 years due to his cooperation with the investigation. Linda Mitchell moved to Florida to live with her sister. Unable to face the daily reminders of her role in the tragedy, she never spoke publicly about the case again, and in Millbrook, life slowly returned to normal, forever changed by the knowledge that evil could hide behind the most trusted facades, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, would eventually find its way to the truth.